Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first Sientir review and analysis of a video game, specifically Middle-earth: Shadow of War. Now, before I begin, I want to kind of give a couple of warnings, I guess. The first one is there will be spoilers. The second one is, in order to make this practical for me to do, the editing is going to be extremely minimal, basically removing dead air at the beginning and end, and sort of balancing out the audio levels a little bit. So there may be some lengthy gaps and other things in the middle that I'm just not going to take care of. But hopefully there's not too many of those. And so I'm going to start just and here's a lengthy gap. I'm just going to start right here at like the first thing about this game that people know, which is loot boxes. I'm fine with the loot boxes. They can kind of feel a little bit gamey, but whatever. I can't really talk about them a whole lot right now because I need to explain all the other systems that they play into to be able to talk about them and why I'm okay with them. Also, I'll be referencing Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, which is the first game, pretty regularly, and I'll probably kind of be comparing them some and stuff, and this game kind of works as an evolution of it. So that's something to kind of expect. I might get some stuff about Shadow of Mordor wrong. Shadow of Mordor wrong because it has frankly been a while since I have played it. So I want to, now that I've kind of gotten some of that preamble done, there's a specific format that I want to take with these, and so I'm going to kind of talk about that. So I'm going to kind of do an analysis of the design. So this is not an examination of the technical prowess. So I'm not going to be looking for things like bugs or glitches or like the quality of the graphics in terms of like, I don't know, basically, I'm not approaching this from a traditional sort of review standpoint of what people would expect. I'm going to rather sort of focus on looking at it through the lens of this three-part game model, a composite game model. And this is a model that I developed in conjunction with Redcoat in the Vernacular Games Design podcasts, and I'm going to examine the game through this sort of model. I will have in the description a link to the specific podcast on the composite game model and the Vernacular channel in general. If you want more about game design from me and from Redcoat, it's more of a general examination. That's a great place to go. So the three parts of the composite game model are theme, mechanics, and Narvazod, and that last one I'll explain in a moment. So to kind of briefly go over this, the theme is what the game is about. The mechanics have to do with how it plays and come in three levels of impact: the foundation, the framing, and the refinement. So this is kind of modeled off of a house. So the foundation is sort of the base of the house. It defines the space that the house occupies. Then the frame, or the framing part, it's the shaping of the house. It defines its shape above the foundation. And then sort of the refining touches, which is the refinement. That's something like wallpaper, for example. It defines its look and feel. And now Narvazod is a term that at Vernacular Games we coined this term because no existing word was something we were really happy with. It is a combination of narrative, visual, and audio, which is where it comes from. Nar for narrative, viz for visual, and odd for audio. And it describes sort of these elements of the game. Now, narrative covers things like plot, characters, lore, that sort of thing. Visual is referring to things like, for example, the art aspect of character environment, animation, visual styling. And audio encompasses things like sound effects and the soundtrack, and just how those things are used as well. This is somewhat similar to the term flavor, but flavor kind of feels sort of anemic. And so, like, Narvazod is kind of on equal terms with mechanic for us. They are two parts of they're two sides of the coin that builds up theme. So they should work together to support the theme. Also, don't be surprised if I use the word Narvazod a lot. It's just permanently under my vocabulary at this point. So also, just as another note, theme kind of, there's multiple levels, so there can be an overarching theme of the game, and I'll talk about some, but there also can be sub-themes. A good example of what I mean by a theme is like a weapon, right? It has the mechanics of how it functions, but also sort of the Narvazod of how it looks and is animated and associated sound effects, any lore about it, things like that. So when mechanics and Narvazod work together, the theme feels well executed, but if either of them are off, even if individually both seem like they could be fine, but they just don't work properly to support the theme, then it feels like it's been poorly executed. So I'm going to kind of be looking at this starting off with like what I perceive the main theme to be of the game, and then kind of breaking down into like various details of things and kind of examining these sub-components, and how various levels like support certain things and whatnot. So as I see it, the primary theme of Middle-earth: Shadow of War is what does it mean to fight evil? And so I feel that it comes at it from several angles, and I do feel that it's ultimately encouraging in the message that it has, but there's also a warning. So I'll get into that in more detail later. I just kind of want to state, like, this is what I'm perceiving sort of the overall theme of the game to be. So just going then into some of the details of how this game works. So the combat system itself is fairly similar to the first game or the Batman Arkham games, where you just kind of have your attack button, your counter button. You can go into like stealth and stuff. They've refined some of the systems from the first game. They've added more types of enemies, which is probably one of the big things that they've done to kind of counteract certain sorts of operations, certain player actions. They've also, with the combat, they've tweaked a number of player abilities a good bit from the first one, and I'll kind of get into those, I guess right now, I might as well. They've changed the character system a lot from the first game. So the first game, Shadow of Mordor, had skills that you could kind of purchase and they'd kind of accumulate. This one has specific skills, sort of base skills that you can unlock, and some of them are you have to beat quests for. But these skills then have like modifiers on them, so sort of sub skills, I guess you could call them, and 2 to 3 you unlock these with skill points. This game has experience. The first game, I don't remember if it had experience points or not, but this game has experience points and other ways to get skill points, which is actually really nice. I actually really appreciate that there's different ways of getting skill points. So there's the reliable one of getting experience, which you generally get through beating higher level orcs, and I'll get into that. Boy, there's a lot of ground to cover here, and I'll get into that in a bit, but or completing various side quests and things like that. So you cap out at level 60, but there's also like lots of quests and other things that give you skill points. And so, like I said, you can have on your character's skills, there's skill modifiers. So a really good example of this, let's see, there's a well-timed counter skill. So if you time your counter action, there's a little flashing indicator, and it goes blue as it gets closer to the enemy about to hit you. And if you counter at that point, rather than just kind of kicking them away, you'll actually knock them down, which lets you do a ground execution on them, which is a special move that's kind of lengthy. There's another skill that improves that considerably, that will then defeat the enemy right away rather than after a few hits, with some caveats, like it doesn't instantly defeat captains, war chiefs, higher level orcs, but anyway, the that skill has 3 modifiers that you can have on it, but you can only have one modifier active at a time. So one of the modifiers, again, the well-timed counter skill, gives you one of your ethereal arrows back. So you have a bow. You know what? I'm going to step back for a moment and go over weapons in some of those systems in more detail. This is what happens when you get stream of consciousness, folks. So your character's combat operations are executed with 3 different combat styles, I guess you could say. One is ranged with a bow that has limited ammunition supplies. Technically, there are 3 types of ranged weapons. There are 2 types of bows. There's the regular standard bow. There's longbow. Longbows usually have less ammunition than the standard bow. They typically also have a bit more damage, and they can penetrate enemies, so they can hit multiple enemies if you can line up your shots. And then there is the hammer, which has usually less ammunition even than the longbow, but it has an area of effect, and if it doesn't take an enemy out, often will knock them down if you land the hit right and stuff like that. So those are the three types there. Then there are there's your stealth sort of mode, which is it's dagger based combat. Generally, this is in the form of stealth attacks, but it also includes ground executions, and there's kind of this weird middle ground between the dagger and the bow, with a kind of a thrown ethereal dagger that you get by quick tapping a button that you normally use to bring up your bow. And this particular dagger also counts as a ranged attack, like the bow or hammer. So if an enemy is immune to arrows, they're immune to these as well. But they get kind of modified based off of the dagger weapon, and I'll go into those in a bit with the inventory system that I want to go over. And then there is your sword. There's only swords. There's not like other types of melee weapons from that regard. This is what focuses on sort of the attack button and counter. Most of the interest in combat comes from the interplay between countering enemies, attacking with your sword, doing things like ground executions. When do you pull out your bow or other ranged options? Dealing with your ammunition supply. It's no particular individual combat system is in itself particularly deep per se. The depth comes from the interplay of them, and also the counter system has a significant impact on it. There's also dodging with the you use it. You can hold it down to sort of sprint. They've done some additional stuff with sprinting. If you push down the movement stick, then it'll give you a temporary speed up. The other thing that I should definitely talk about is focus. Focus it was a resource in the first game, and it does the same thing in this one, but more, or is used for more, is more accurate. So focus kind of represents, I guess, mental stamina or something. It kind of works as a stamina system. In the first game and in this one, when you pull out your bow, you automatically enter a slowed down time mode, which is really useful because you're trying to aim with a control stick. And most players will agree that aiming with a control stick is not as accurate as aiming with a mouse. I did play this game on a gamepad, by the way. An Xbox 360 wired gamepad for those who care, and on my PC. And so that's one of the main uses of focus is slowing down time when you pull out your bow. But it's far from the only one. I'll get into the others later because they're kind of more in the skill system. But the other one that I'm going to mention right now is that you can consume focus by pushing in the movement stick to give yourself a temporary speed buff. In the first game, this was only able to be accomplished, this movement speed buff, when running over obstacles. There'd be moments where you could hit the run button to gain a temporary boost of speed, run/dodge. And this temporary boost of speed is what you can manually activate, but it consumes some focus to manually activate it. You can still get it by jumping over obstacles, and that doesn't consume focus. So that's important to note. You also can, I think you might have to unlock it, but you also get the ability to use it when climbing up cliffs to kind of vault up them, which is really nice because it means you can climb a building in like a couple of bounds rather than like tediously crawling up it. I don't remember if the first game had something like that or not. I think it did, though. Again, it's been a while since I've played it, and I've actually, according to my Steam stats, I've played more Shadow of War than I did of the first game. I beat the first game and its DLCs and kind of have faffed about in it a bit afterwards. And I only just recently beat Shadow of War and have about 10 more hours in Shadow of War according to Steam stats. So that'll give you some idea of length, I suppose. So this counter skill, which is what I was originally talking about before I realized I needed to talk about the combat system more. If you time your counter well, it knocks the enemy down. That's its base. Then you can unlock, if you get the well-timed counter for all of these is when their benefit comes up. One of them gives you an arrow back, regenerates an arrow, however you want to kind of view that. And then one of them gives you might, and I just realized I didn't explain might. So in the first game, like many of the Batman games, if you have a hit streak where you've hit enemies without getting hit, or at least hit too much yourself, you build up hit streak. Hit streak is still in this game, but it's a lot less relevant because to perform special moves, which I also now realize I didn't mention, you would use hit streak, but that system has been split to no longer be part of hit streak per se and is part of something called might. So one of your well-timed counters options gives you might, which is very useful because that can be done to use special moves. I'm going to go over those more in a moment just because they're more part of the character skill system than they are... I mean, they're used in combat, but they're part of the character skill system. And then the last one turns it from knockdown to an insta-kill on non-captains. I should take a moment to explain sort of the enemies you face. They come in, I guess, technically 3 categories. Standard orcs that are called grunts. These come in a couple of varieties. I'll go over that in a second. Captains, which are upgraded versions of grunts that have like a name, a personality, will tell you all about themselves when they see you in combat, and have special abilities that make them buffer. For example, they have the ability to pull out a different weapon is a good example, or the ability to kind of do a charging tackle that you really don't want to be hit by. You need to dodge those. Things like that. And then there are beasts, which you can generally ride except for ghouls and spiders, which are just too small. So I'm just going to kind of work through this beasts first, then orc categories. So beasts, like I mentioned, they're spiders. There are ghouls. Ghouls make a return from the first game. Caragors make a return from the first game. Ghouls are kind of like zombies, except they eat dead things. They're kind of these weird scavengery things. Then the Caragors are basically kind of like a large, cat-ish like predator thing that you can ride. It's fairly large. And then there's Grogs, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which are just kind of your very large, hairless primate-like thing, kind of your King Kong type character in a way, that are extremely big, extremely damaging, very powerful. And then there are drakes, which make Grogs look like child's play, because drakes, they don't have as much health. They're not quite as durable, I think, but they fly and they can breathe fire. And they can just pick up grunts and eat them. So, just whenever. They move very quickly. They can't be hit by melee unless they land, which they don't tend to do so often. They're extremely powerful to ride as well, and they're a great deal of fun. There are, just for completeness, a few variants on Grogs that are like elementally imbued. They're fairly rare. They also have breath attacks and kind of play like grounded, beefy Grog Drake hybrids. And then orcs. So these generally come in a couple of categories. You have your standard orc grunt, which just has some sort of melee weapon that they attack you with. You have your hunters, which have spears. They're fairly similar to crossbowmen, which naturally attack you with crossbows. Both of those, the hunters and the crossbowmen, are ranged, although they can attack in melee if you get up close to them. I think hunters deal a bit more damage, is one of the big differences, and they don't tend to patrol upper areas as much as archers do. Archers are generally a little bit weaker. Then you have your savages, which have usually like 2 axes. Their gimmick is you can't just straight attack them per se. I think you kind of can if your hit streak is high enough. But if your hit streak isn't high enough, then they'll counter you, which hurts and takes off most of your might when they perform their counter on you. So that's something you want to avoid. And then there are defenders, which have a spear and a shield. They're really obnoxious to combat because you can't just attack through their shield. If your hit streak, again, is high enough, you can kind of bust through it. This is where a hit streak comes in, by the way. And then there are Ologhai, which are new to this game specifically. They're basically trolls. If you remember in the Lord of the Rings movie, when they're in the Mines of Moria, I think... It's been a while since I've watched them. I want to rewatch them, but I think it was in the Fellowship of the Ring that they were in the Mines of Moria? Or was that... Oh, I think the movies ended in... Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But if you remember that scene where there's the troll inside the cave, they're kind of like that. They are like half again as tall as a standard orc. They... you can't, like, they have attacks. So they're more of a timing puzzle than the other orcs. You can't counter any of their attacks per se, but many of their attacks you can dodge more easily. They have much more of a time dilation when you need to dodge. And I think that was done because you either need to dodge their attacks or you can hit the stun button to kind of counter them and put them in a stunned state where you can attack them. And when you put them in that stunned state, you can also climb on their back and kind of ride them around sort of rampagey style. I feel like that might have been a mechanic with a different enemy in the first game, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, so they're large. You can't just counter them. You also cannot just vault over them. So mini orcs, when you dodge, you can dodge over their head. Again, that might be a skill you need to unlock. I don't remember. But if you dodge over their head, naturally you land behind them, but you can't do that with Ologhai. You also can't generally just use your domination skill on Ologhai. So there's a couple of things where they're like, no, you can't do that, and smash you into the ground. It usually doesn't do any damage, which is good, because one of my complaints about the game is it's not always great about knowing what you're trying to do. So if there's an Ologhai around and you're like, I want to dodge around this guy, it will sometimes be, did you mean you wanted to dodge into his hand and get smashed to the ground? It's like, no, I meant I wanted to dodge around him. Thanks, game. Usually that's not too detrimental. It's just kind of like a little eye-rolly. I will kind of go over some of my critiques of the game for sure as I go through things. But anyway, so these different types of enemies give you different things to do, different things to combat. Like I mentioned, there's dodge. There's also your stun button. The first game kind of played it up as some sort of like ethereal light. This game makes it frost. There are different sort of elemental effects that can be placed on enemies. I know I'm going into a lot of detail, but that's kind of what you can expect. So there is the frost effect from the stun. There's also burning, poison, which are like 2 different damage over time things. And there's curse, which is damage over time as well. When you're afflicted by these, they have slightly different effects on you. Burning is mostly just, it hurts a lot. Poison will like interrupt certain abilities and stuff and like make you really slow in things. And curse drains all of your focus. I think poison does as well, actually. Curse drains all of your focus and it also drains your wrath, which is another meter. So for those of you who've played the first game, you had, with each of your different weapon styles, you could kind of build up this meter that let you go into a super mode that gave you things like the dagger one let you kind of go into stealth in the middle of where everybody could see you. The sword one gave you unlimited ability to do executions, is what they called them. They have rebranded that system a little bit in this one. But anyway, what they've done here is they've kind of replaced it with something called Elven Might, which comes in two different styles. That's something I'm going to get into later. But the first one, you kind of just spam the attack button to just shoot arrows at everything around you. It's like 2/3 of the way. I can't give you percentages. I'll get into how the plot works. There's a certain point in the plot where the nature of things changes. They give you enormous quantities of heads up about it, which is really appreciated. The description of that quest is like, this is it, the final confrontation sort of thing. Like, they make it sound really like it's a point of no return. They explicitly say it's a point of no return. And they also, when you get close to where that mission starts, they're like, are you sure you want to do this and haven't done everything else? Because you're going to want to have done everything else before. So they do a really good job about that, which is really appreciated. Okay, so I've kind of gone into a lot of detail here about how the combat system works, but it is a key part of the game. And one of the things actually that, just to step back for a moment, I really appreciate about the combat system is not only is it fun, but when you execute on it well, you feel really powerful. And it also does a really good job of backing up the idea that your character, Talion, so Talion / Celebrimbor, is just ridiculously powerful and deadly and a terror to the orcs of Mordor. You know why they call your character the Grave Walker. He is absolutely terrifying. He's preternaturally powerful. They've done a really good job of adding... in game design, we call them barks, but little sound clips that the enemies say in mid-combat and stuff that reinforce, you're friggin' terrifying. And when you step back and you look at all of your abilities in combat, you're like, yeah, this character is ludicrous. This character is single-handedly able to take down armies of orcs, and it's just that is terrifying. This character is no joke. It's super, super powerful. And when you look at your abilities, you can see that. You have, your normal soldiers of men sort of thing, and they are nowhere near what your character is. There's just no comparison. For example, when multiple enemies are attacking you, this is just a very simple example. If you can hit the counter button twice, and your Wraith, Celebrimbor, will come out and counter the second enemy. You're in the middle of parrying somebody, and just the spectral form counters the other person. That's actually terrifying when you think about it. And a lot of these combat abilities do a really, really good job of reinforcing this sort of motif. So going back to kind of some of the skills then, gaining might is really useful. Insta-killing an enemy is really useful. One of the abilities that you unlock on the ground execution that's really useful is you can counter. You can have your Wraith counter while you are doing a ground execution, which makes it a lot easier to do in the midst of combat. So that's really powerful, and also kind of plays into that sort of your terrifying specter haunting the orcs sort of theme. So there's some other abilities I mentioned, sort of these special things that use might. So you start off with 3 of them that you can unlock. So one of them is just a raw execution. It just one-shots an orc or deals a lot of damage to a captain. And then there is... you can unlock a more powerful version later that terrifies enemies. It's a move that I don't tend to use much, just because I feel other options are better, but it's really useful against captains, particularly captains who are vulnerable to executions. And then there is the consume is what they call it in this one. I forget I think they called it combat drain in the first one, but basically you perform sort of the drain action, which is not really a combat ability, the standard drain action. So it's the B on my controller, but that button performs the stun action if you tap it, but if you hold it, it starts draining an enemy. That will restore some amount of health and potentially have another effect depending upon where you are in the plot and what things you've unlocked. By pretty early on, you can get the ability for it to return ammunition. You can have an effect that makes it do a full heal, other things like that. But anyway, like I said, it's not really a combat ability because it's quite slow for the most part. So there's a combat version of it that you can actually perform in combat, and they call that consume in this game. And then in the first game, there was kind of this shockwave thing that could knock down enemies if your combat streak was high enough. That one is kind of just been upgraded in this one, and it's interesting because there's also a bow one, and the reason why I bring it up is because they both do kind of a similar thing. They have an AoE effect. Just one is point blank area of effect around your character, and the other is wherever your arrow hits. And these can cause poison, burn, or frost depending upon your upgrade in sort of that area of effect. So set enemies in the area on fire, poison them, or freeze them. I will also add that I severely underestimated the power of freezing enemies around you when I first started playing the game. It's actually really, really good, especially with some gear that you can get later, but I'm talking about gear later. So there's some really notable upgrades. I'm not going to go over everything because that's just going to take way too long, and I'm not going that in depth. I'm going a lot in depth, but I'm not going that in depth. Some of the notable things are in skills that I still want to cover. The ability to summon mounts is really, really cool. So you can summon a Karagor, then you can get another version that lets you summon a Grog, and once you complete certain story stuff, you can even get the ability to summon a Drake, although it doesn't work in all areas. Okay. So, the other notable abilities I want to mention, there is Shadow Strike, which is the ability to use your bow to teleport to an enemy, and a normal grunt you'll one-shot or knock down, depending upon which version you do. You can get a modifier to that lets you chain this ability, and the chaining consumes focus. In the first game, you had this ability, but consumed additional arrows, and was ridiculously overpowered because of the way that you could loop stuff together. But I'm not going to get into that because we're not talking about that game as much. And then another one you can also get... So this chaining ability is something that you can unlock for your standard stealth attack. So you perform a stealth attack, and you can chain that using focus to other nearby enemies. This is actually kind of plays in a similar space to the first game's dagger ultimate ability thing. And then you can also use an ability that lets you chain executions, which sounds really good, but also is competing with the ability that allows you to make all of your special 2-button combination moves not consume your entire... So it's on an ability that gives you double might meter, so it doubles up your might meter, so you can kind of hold 2 charges, and it makes it use only one of those instead of all of that. And that ability is super good, and I don't want to not use it. You can also chain the consume ability, which can be really, really powerful depending upon other modifiers that you have set up for various reasons. So one of the other things is that one of the big things in the game is gaining control of orcs. So you're trying to raise an army to combat Sauron by basically mind controlling orcs. So one of the lower level abilities is the ability to sort of use your mind wraith powers on orcs, and you can choose whether or not doing that gives you, like, it restores some health. I mentioned it earlier. It's called Drain. You can have it either mind control them, give you ammunition back, or give you some of the wrath that powers up your super state, and also make it so that way when you do it, it fully heals you. So you have some competition about whether or not you're going to do that, but chain, basically they call it dominating instead of draining when you mind control them. And chain dominating is super powerful. So the chaining aspect of things is something that I really like, and I like the way that they made it play off of focus as well. And that's one of your other big uses of focus other than doing stuff with your bow. So then I really need to now... that covers skills generally for the most part. There's a bunch of other things. There's another super move that you unlock partway through that lets you basically reanimate dead enemies around you. And that one is very good, but I don't tend to use it as much as some of the other ones, just because that button combination is a little awkward. Oh, that reminds me. They also added a, if you hold down X, you can charge up something called your glaive, which is just kind of a bigger sweeping attack. It's a little awkward to do in combat, though, because you need enough space from enemies that you can spend the moment to charge it up, but you also can't move while you're charging it up, so you need to be close enough to enemies that you can hit them. It's one of those ideas that's like 70% there, but is like missing that last little bit that makes it actually practical to do. Like, if it consumed a little bit of... like, if you could have the ability to consume a little bit of focus to dilate time when you're charging it up, so that way you could actually do it next to enemies, that would make it way more useful. But as it is, you can be interrupted out of charging it up. I forgot about it because I don't tend to use it a whole lot. And then I want to talk about inventory. Okay, so your inventory system in this game, very different from the first one. You start off with 5, you unlock a 6th weapon or equipment slots, I guess is the appropriate way to say it. So you have your melee weapon, your stealth weapon, so that's your sword, your dagger, your ranged weapon, your bow, longbow, or hammer, your armor, your cloak, and your rune, which goes into your ring. And I'll be talking about lore plot stuff in a bit, but you basically... you have these different slots, you get different items. These items have built-in modifiers. They come in common, rare, epic, and legendary. Legendary stuff has set bonuses. So a really good example is there's the Bright Lord set, which is kind of themed off of Celebrimbor. His sword is super good, by the way. But all the legendary stuff has... okay, so common stuff is just... it's got a number on it, so like how much damage it has. I don't know what the cloak stealth thing does, but I think it affects how quickly enemies notice you. I don't know. The rune for the ring gives more focus, which is really good, because having lots of focus is good. The armor gives you health, which is a very straightforward way of doing it. And then how much damage the bow, ranged weapon, dagger, and sword deal. Then you get the rare level. They have a modifier on it. And one of the things that's really cool that they've done is that these modifiers have a certain sort of quest that you need to do, like kill an enemy that's poisoned, or get 3 headshots, or drain 5 enemies, or whatever. Kill enemies with no focus with your bow. Just different sorts of little things to do that kind of allow you to upgrade them a level and unlock the ability, which just adds a little bit more to it. Also provides a minor Mirian sync. I'm going to get into the economy later. So Mirian is your currency, by the way, your primary currency. So I've thrown my train of thought off. Okay, so the rare weapons have 1 modifier in them. Epic have 2, and then legendary also have 2. But if you equip multiple pieces of a legendary set, they have a bonus at 2 and a bonus at 4. So notably, there's not a bonus at 6, which means that you can get the full set bonus of one and half the set bonus of another legendary set, which is actually something that I really like. One of the things that can be a big problem with set bonuses is it kind of says you have to build your character this way to get the full benefit from having this set, and they don't do that in this game. They let you 2/3 it, which I really, really appreciate a lot. And enemy orcs, actually, back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. So then there's the second part of the equipment system, which is gems. So gems come in something like 5 tiers. You can upgrade gems to a higher tier by combining 3 of the current tier. So, for example, if you have 3 of the lowest tier, you can combine them to be 1 of the next tier up. And you can keep doing this until you get sort of the max tier gem. Gems come in 3 categories. Health, I don't remember what they call the red one. It's the one that increases your damage. I want to call it Wrath, but I don't remember. And then wealth, which they're green for health, red for damage, and white for wealth. So the effects of this vary depending upon what you equip them into. So if you equip them into a weapon slot, so you can change your weapons and your gems independently of each other. There's like no sort of restriction on that. It's really, really nice. If you equip it, so I'll go in the 3 categories. If you equip it into a weapon first, the red ones increase that weapon's damage by a fairly substantial %. If you equip the health gem, then I'm not entirely sure how the system works, but I figured out enough of it gives you a percentage of the damage you deal back as health, is the way I understand it, and that's what it seems to be doing. And then wealth gives a % chance that when you defeat enemies with that weapon, they'll drop some of the mirroring currency. Okay, armor. So you have 2 armor slots, your cloak and your just armor. And these things do have different skins, by the way. They have different appearances, which I think is really cool. So you can change how you look based upon like what equipment you have on. So if you equip a gem into the armor, the damage gem gives you more damage with all weapons, but it's a much smaller bonus, about half, I think. The strength of if you equip it into a specific weapon. And then the health one gives you a percentage more HP, and the wealth one does something that I haven't done in a very long time and don't remember. Well, that one I don't remember, so obviously it's not important. That's okay. I didn't take notes on that. And then the last one in the ring slot, the damage one increases the damage that your allied orcs do. The green one decreases the damage they take, and the white one the wealth one increases the number of levels that an allied orc gets when you an allied captain gets when you first mind control them. So that's really powerful. It increases it. That helps a lot for hitting some of the unlock goals. Your legendary weapons can be upgraded multiple times, up to being a level 60 weapon. Level 60 is sort of like the max level, as it were. Your character caps out at level 60. I've gotten some legendary stuff, and I think some non-legendary stuff that's above level 60. But anyway, most of the weapons require you to dominate an orc from a specific tribe, because the legendary sets are generally associated with a tribe. There's the Bright Lord set, which is not, and that requires you to do specific classes rather than a specific tribe that you're dominating. And I actually really like these games because they kind of... So the way you get loot, which is what I want to go into now, and then I'll kind of expand on the point I was just about to touch on, is when you kill a captain, they will drop you a weapon based upon their class, and they are all categorized as either like an orc, a rare orc, I guess, an epic, or legendary. So they drop a weapon based upon, and maybe it's just like normal orc has a chance to drop a rare. I don't know. Like at this point, I don't look at rares even. They're just not worth looking at. But like that, then that happens late game with this sort of thing because I've accumulated enough legendary weapons that like the commons are all basically like not useful. Well, not useful, but they're less useful. And I'm at the point where like it has to be at least epic for me to even care about it. But they're specifically labeled epic or legendary, and they usually have more modifiers, so they're more powerful enemies as well. So when we then kind of continuing on here, looking at the defeating them or killing them gives you a weapon, which is really useful because it creates kind of this incentive system between killing an enemy orc and mind controlling them. If you mind control them, you don't get their gear unless they die later in battle, and then you get their gear. So they only drop their gear on death. And I really appreciate this sort of system. One of the problems that I had with the first game, so the first game had a rune system. You didn't have equipment per se, but you had runes, specific classes of runes. And you kind of would hit a point where it didn't feel like you were really incentivized to kill enemies because you would get runes of a certain quality and then like there's no reason. Basically, once you got a certain setup, is there really a reason to change? This game has a much more compelling build system because you have a much tighter interplay between your weapons and your equipment and what skills you have equipped. This is particularly true with the legendary bonuses and sort of the intermingling there. And a good example is I have a bow that decreases the focus cost to do the chain chain of shadows is I think what the skill is called, but basically where you teleport to an orc and one-shot them, right? And it decreases the focus consumed by 40%, which means that you can chain it a lot more times, like a lot more times. Like that incentivizes a particular skill combination, whereas, for example, if I don't have that becomes a lot more expensive to do. And if I have instead the rune in that gives me an arrow back when I dominate an enemy, then that means that I might, instead of using the Chain of Shadows sub-skill on Shadow Strike, I want to use Shadow Dominate, which lets me teleport to an orc and dominate them. And when that gives me an arrow back because of the armor piece that I have in, that changes like what I'm incentivized to do gameplay-wise, and that kind of combines together to create a much more intricate build system. Another really good example of this is the Bright Lord Sword. I mentioned it was really good. Well, part of the reason is it has a modifier on it that they call it Ice Storm Finisher, but basically when you kill an enemy that's been frozen with your sword, it uses sort of a special finisher move. And this interplays with Bright Lord's Sword by giving you a giant pile of wrath when you do that. So that incentivizes you to use the point blank and the bow special attacks that cause freeze, because you can AoE freeze enemies and then go around like killing them rapidly to gain your wrath, and it really combines quite well. So what skills and weapons you want in can really vary based on that. I will say that for the most part, the gem system is a little bit less interesting, and once you kind of have the gems that you want, for example, I have health gems in all of my weapons, attack up gems in all of my armor pieces to get. I'm not quite sure if they combine to give me 30% more attack or exactly how that's working, because I don't know the exact math on that. It doesn't matter. I'm getting each one is 15% more, and however those stack. and then plus 5 levels when I mind control a captain level, a captain class work. So I have spent almost 50 minutes now, and I haven't talked about primarily what you're trying to accomplish in the game. So I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to that. So the basic overview of the narrative of the game, it starts in Minas Ithil, and I'm just going to take a quick aside. For those people who are fans of Lord of the Rings and have actually like read J.R.R. Tolkien's timeline and things like that, this game doesn't follow it that well. It gets a number of things right and kind of fudges a lot of other stuff. So you kind of start off the game making a new ring of power. And this ring of power is, for some reason, allows you to dominate orcs. I don't know exactly. Again, I don't remember the plot that happened in the first game. So, but this occurs. There's text information in the game that indicates this occurs somewhere between when Bilbo collects the One Ring from Gollum in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. Like, it occurs somewhere in there. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense exactly where it fits in timeline-wise, so they kind of fudged a lot of that. So hardcore Lord of the Rings fans, I'm sorry. This game basically, it comes in 4 or 5 acts. And the first act is Shelob, for some reason, can turn into a sexy lady and somehow captures Celebrimbor, and you give her the new ring in order to get Celebrimbor back. And then you go try to defend Minas Ithil, which is sort of across from Minas Tirith, with Osgiliath between them, roughly geographically. If you zoom out on the world map, there are 5 regions, by the way, in the game, as opposed to 2 in the first one. You can actually see where everything is geographically. So where Minas Tirith is, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil. And the first part is sort of the fall of Minas Ithil. It becomes Minas Morgul. So that's sort of where the Witch King has his domain. And so the first part of the game kind of focuses on wanting to get the Palantir, which is a seeing stone, and it kind of lets you see stuff. They've refined a number of things in this game over the first one as well. Like they have these towers, and this is actually a really cool minigame that they have. So they call them the Haydir. I don't know if that's lore correct or not, but they're kind of like cheap knockoff Palantirs. And these are at the tops of specific towers that you can fast travel to, etc. They work similar to the fast travel towers in the first game. Like there are spots where you respawn if you die, and things like that. And I should mention that, like, if you die, you just time advances and you respawn and stuff happens. It's kind of a big deal. It's not a big deal at the same time. I'll kind of go over that more in a bit when I get some more of the what you're actively doing through a lot of the game. I'm setting that up right now. So you start off much more direct in your plot, and this is actually something that I really like that this game does. That is, it kind of starts with a focused plot and kind of expands as you get comfortable with the systems and being directed with what to do. So the first part is very much so focused on, we want to try to get the Palantir, and it's kind of this tension between Celebrimbor wanting to get the Palantir and being gung-ho focused on taking out Sauron, and Talion wanting to save the people in front of him in Minas Ithil. And what you end up sort of seeing, and again, just to bring it up, there's going to be story spoilers here as I go over kind of the phases of how the narrative plays out. The captain, Casimir, something like that. Apologies. Has the Plantier and kind of trades it to the Witch King to try to save his daughter and gets betrayed. And this is kind of Castamere. I have it written down in some notes of the things that I wanted to talk about. So this is kind of the first character of warning. So Castamere wants to bargain with evil, and that doesn't work. You can't just give evil what it wants. Like, that doesn't work. We know it doesn't work, and yet people still try to do it. Because the problem here is the assumption that evil is honorable. And it isn't. And so it will do whatever it can to get what it wants. And it doesn't care about a promise or an oath or a bargain. It breaks those easily and readily. If it can do it to manipulate you, it will. And it doesn't care about keeping it. And that's kind of the first warning. And it's one that we all conceptually know, but often not realize. And you can't, making as it were, sort of a bargain with the devil doesn't work because the devil doesn't keep bargains. And so that's kind of the first character of warning. So what we kind of see, back to the Hadir thing, this mechanic that I really like. When you capture one of these towers, sort of the idea is you claim the Hadir in it. And this kind of puts you in a mode where you can look around and kind of play this mini game where you find the locations of world collectibles, which I think is actually really cool. World collectibles come in a few varieties. Shelob Memories is one of them. So this kind of tells you about, like, what happened to Shelob. Again, pretty sure this is canon only for the sake of these games, and is not canon for Lord of the Rings at all, because we have sexy lady Shelob dating Sauron, it looks like. I do like how they present Sauron as an elf. And they do kind of understand some of the lore, like Morgoth being... So, for those who haven't read the Silmarillion, there's more of a cosmology to Lord of the Rings, and I think a lot of people really understand. So Zeluvator, which is kind of a god figure, a creator figure who kind of makes everything, and with the Valar, if I remember, it's been a while since I read the Silmarillion, so I might be getting some of the terms wrong, and my apologies for that. The Valar are kind of like archangels, I guess you could think of them as, and Morgoth is one of them. And then there's the Maiar, which is what Balrogs are, and also what the wizards are, and Sauron is as well, if I'm remembering this correctly. So Sauron is on is a comparable type of entity as a Balrog, which is a comparable type of entity to Gandalf. So this is and Saruman and stuff. So this kind of should give you a little bit of an idea. They're kind of like an angel class, and then you have elves, dwarves, and men, all kind of formed in different ways. So when you're looking at these sorts of things, it's useful to remember that. So in this sort of cosmology, the idea is Sauron wants to kind of put things to order, and order things is kind of what they're saying his motivations are. I'm not sure how much Tolkien actually elaborated on Morgoth, and Morgoth's motivations I know. Sauron was I want to say like a servant or whatever. He worked for Morgoth before Morgoth was defeated in the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is actually really interesting from the standpoint of, like, Galadriel was a bit of a roguish figure. You don't think of her that way, but she was, and things like that. But anyway, so when you so again, I think this is pretty, like, they're making stuff up. I would say apocryphal, but I'm not sure how many people know that term. So anyway, with Shelob, she also apparently has the ability to like see the web of fate and has visions of possible futures and stuff like that. And she doesn't want a dominating force ruling over Middle Earth. So it has her starting off as like sexy lady dating Sauron and being like, no, this guy's evil and he's going to screw everything up and whatever. So you unlock her memories of like her transformation into Spider Person. And that's one of the collectibles. Then there are artifacts from Gondor, which are really kind of cool. They give you various bits. One of the characters, Idril, talks about them. She's Castamir's daughter that he makes a bargain with the Witch King to try to save. And then there is the Ithil, something like that. I don't remember exactly what they call them. Basically, they're these elven words that you can find, and then around the area map. And this is how you get the Bright Lord armor. You go into, they call them Celebrimbor's barrows, Barrows, and they're within each of those and each of the different maps. Like I said, there's 5, and you get the last armor piece. Each one has a different armor piece. You get the last one by completing other special Celebrimbor themed missions. But when you collect these, all of the like 6 words in the area, you can go to kind of a poem, as it were, and you have to fill in the blank. And that's kind of an interesting way of doing it, and I kind of appreciate that method of doing things, and I really quite enjoyed that. And it plays into sort of the elven like artisan style of things as well, which I think is really cool. So that's how you unlock the Bright Lord stuff, is collecting those. Like I said, you have the Gondorian artifacts. I think those are the collectibles. But you find all of those things in this sort of like mini game where you kind of sweep your vision around the area, and it kind of has a ring that gets closer as you get closer, and then you kind of highlight them, which is a much more compelling way of doing that sort of thing than just like spawning them on the map, which is part of why I'm bringing it up like this in detail, is you're actually like not just, okay, I got this tower, it reveals part of the world map, and here are the things. No, I think you start off with the world map, but you start off with the map of the region, but you use conquering these things to locate where the collectibles are, and it doesn't just reveal them for you, you actively reveal them for yourself. And I find that to be really interesting and really compelling. Now I'm going to take a moment to drink some water. Okay, so that's something that I really like, and it also plays into sort of these themes as well that are going on with the game of knowing where things are, and like almost sort of a Sauron-esque effect to things. Because one of the other themes that's going on in this game is that Celebrimbor is starting to walk on Sauron's path. And he's starting to think the way Sauron does and behave like Sauron does. And I'll get into more on what's going on with that later. But this is a way of mechanically having you explore the area that reinforces that theme of starting to behave a bit like Sauron. Starting to think a bit like Sauron. And as you go on, like this sort of thing kind of builds up and happens. So once Minas Ithil falls and Minas Morgul happens, we kind of enter into the next phase of the game. And I'd really kind of say there's like 3 phases of the game. The first one is pre-Ring, leading up to the fall of Minas Ithil. Then the second one is leading up to the final confrontation that sort of happens at the end of the game. And the end is a bit disingenuous, and then there's the part that happens after that sort of final confrontation. So in this sort of middle section, you no longer have as heavily of a directed plot that you're following. Rather, you've got a bunch of side quests. And the game is all about sort of doing these side quests. So I'm going to go over a couple of different categories of them. So it starts off a little bit more directed with which side quests to follow, because sort of the main idea is you have 4 world regions that you want to conquer the fortresses of. Excuse me, to control the region. So, Saragost, Nurnin, Gorgoroth, and Kirith Ungol. And these, there's a fortress in each region. There's also the region of Minas Ithil, but that doesn't come into play a whole lot during this time. You can go visit it. It's Minas Morgul now. You can go visit that area, but that fortress is being held by Nazgul, and you can't just walk into the Nazgul territory. You can just walk into an orc-held fortress, though. And there's various points in the game where you confront the Nazgul and fight them. They are difficult because they have more of the teleporty type abilities that you have that make you utterly terrifying. Surprise, surprise. And you learn kind of the stories of a couple of them, some of which is not entirely accurate to Tolkien lore. Surprise. Isildur didn't become a ring wraith, but in these games he does. So you learn about him, Helm Hammerhand, and Saladin, I don't know, something like that. And how they became ring wraiths. Or accepted rings of power and stuff. Again, I think some of this is a little bit apocryphal or made up for the sake of the game. Golem makes an appearance, by the way. So timeline stuff I mentioned, and I'm just going to bring it up briefly. For context, for people who haven't looked at this, Minas Morgul falls in about the year 2000-ish in Lord of the Rings stuff, whereas the actual Lord of the Rings events occur in 3017. So yeah, they futzed with the timeline a bit here. When Minas Morgul fell, Golem hadn't been born. He wouldn't be for another 500 years at least. So while when Minas Ithil fell and became Minas Morgul, I should say, there was a Palantir captured there, etc. So there's some accuracy, but some weirdness, and it's just anyway. So the idea is you capture these fortresses. So your initial goal is to build up a collection of captains to be an assault force, and you do this by mind controlling the captains, and then you can assign siege upgrades. So then you go into these fortresses. You need to capture various points in them. And then once you capture them all, you can fight the Overlord. And then once you capture the fortress, you can install one of your orcs as Overlord and War Chiefs, and you can unlock more War Chief slots to upgrade the defenses of your castle. There's a couple of online features that I'm going to mention at this point, just because they kind of segue in here nicely. So there's the ability to assault other players' fortresses. So this doesn't impact them directly, but beating them lets you get spoils of war as well as a conquest chest, and kind of plays into some online leaderboardish type stuff. So this is the first part where loot chests come in. So at this point I can go over loot chests briefly. Though before I do, there's also online vendetta, which is basically where you go into another player's world to kill an orc that killed them. So this is kind of a really cool player interaction system, and it gives the game a lot more legs. And I actually feel like it really plays into one of the other sorts of themes that the game has, because I feel like one of the big things is that sometimes victory against evil is maintaining a stalemate, and I feel like these things kind of can play into that theme, and overall, there's a lot that plays into that idea of it's not necessarily about wiping out evil. It's about fighting to keep evil at bay. And this is, and I'm going to talk about this more later as I get through more of the plot and explain more things, but this really, the online stuff, I feel kind of plays into that a little bit, just from the standpoint of continuing to do stuff and having things that are continuing that you can continue to do. that are like compelling to do. I don't know that this game has the sort of Trials of War sort of mode, or I forget if that's what they called it or not, but that the first game had, that kind of had online leaderboard. But this plays into that same area, but it's a little bit more integrated. So your rewards from doing those things are basically loot chests, and then like Spoils of War gets you a more fancy loot chest. So loot chests basically come in two major varieties: equipment loot chests and follower loot chests. Equipment stuff that you can just get in the game as it is by killing captains, and followers are just things that you can do by mind controlling captains. So it's nothing that you can't get in the game, but it can be kind of convenient to like just buy them. There's 3 tiers of loot chest: limited quantity blue chests, which have like guaranteed like high quality stuff, but you can only buy a limited number of them. They require gold, which is real world, which you can acquire through doing. There's one point in the game where they give you like 500 gold, and then occasionally they have quests that give you like 50. Follower chests are usually a bit more expensive, or maybe about twice the price of loot chests. But you can buy a limited quantity of blue ones with gold, and then there's the higher quality gold chests that you can buy with gold, and then there's white chests that you can buy with Mirian, which is the in-game currency, which provides theoretically a little bit of Mirian dump. So there's a couple of ways that you can get Mirian. Predominantly, you either pick it up from enemies that drop like using wealth gems or marauder gear, which cause enemies to drop Mirian when you kill them. There's also specifically enemies can have a little "I have loot" indicator over them, and they will drop gems or Mirian. You can also acquire gems by blowing up statues that you come across that the orcs have built, and you'll get plenty of both. And you also get Mirian by destroying unwanted equipment. I like that the common loot chests theoretically give you something to dump Mirian into. You use it to buy a lot in this game. One of the complaints that I had about the first game is you would kind of get to the point where you had a giant pile of Mirian and nothing to do with it. And you at least have things that you can theoretically do with it in this game. You use it to buy your gem slots initially. You use it to buy... you can use it on loot chests. You can use it, and you also use it to buy siege upgrades. Although there's a bunch of one-time purchases. Just unlocking higher tiers on your equipment costs a little bit of Mirian, more for legendary gear, and that's kind of a Mirian sink, but not a sustainable one per se. And then you can dump it into loot crates if you want to. So you can, for example, buy yourself a bunch of followers and follower orders, which allow you to do things like, hey, I want this guy to ride a Caregor, or I want this guy to have a poison weapon, or whatever, things like that. So the online stuff gives you loot chests. Like I said, I don't feel like the loot chests are a big deal. You can get basically everything that they offer that's of substance through just either it's the orders and stuff that, as far as I understand it, you can just get those through buying a bunch of the orc loot chests with Mirian, and otherwise it's like kill enemies and or mind control them is another way of getting it. But it's a nice sort of additional way. If you don't feel like mind controlling some orcs, you can just like buy some. So anyway, that kind of digressed a little bit, but so a big part of the gameplay in like the third section of the game, I guess, is all about fortresses. But anyway, the second part is more about side quests. So you have the side quests with Bruise, which focus initially on, and this is kind of where you start off. He's an Ola guy, and you capture the Fortress of Nurnin with him. There's some cameos of characters from the first game as you do that. And then he kind of decides, you know what, I want this fortress. I'm going to backstab you. And then there's quests with dealing with that backstabbing jerk. There's quests with sort of nature stuff with the spirit of nature called Karnan, which has kind of a forest. You do stuff there. You fight a Balrog. It's epic. And that has also stuff to do with a necromancer orc called Zog who shows up a bunch. Then there's side quests with the Gondorians who fled from Minas Ithil, particularly focusing on Idril and I don't remember the other guy's name, but there's a captain also. So there's kind of like two humans from Gondor that you kind of work with a bit with some quests with them. There's the capturing the various fortresses. There's doing sort of these fight pits where you kind of pit your minions against random orcs. There's the Eltariel quests. So Eltariel is an elf, the Blade of Gladriel, and she's been fighting the Nazgul for a long while, it sounds like, trying to keep them at bay, trying to keep them in Mordor, and teaming up with her. You follow a lot of stuff with Shelob initially. So there's a bunch of side quests. I don't know that I've been exhaustive on the different side quest lines, but this sort of middle portion of the game is focused on doing a lot of these sort of side quests. There's also the Celebrimbor quests where he like recounts the ways that he went about conquering Middle Earth, or trying to conquer Mordor initially in his initial run. It gets referenced in the first game as well, but they kind of he had an initial run that failed. And it's kind of an initial attempt to conquer Mordor after he was betrayed by Sauron, or leading up to it. I don't remember the exact timeline. So there's those as well that you kind of find around. And what ends up happening is you kind of reach this point where you feel like, okay, what I've got a bunch of side quests to do, but I don't necessarily have a strong sense of what my main quest is. And eventually you kind of pick up the threads, okay, finishing Eltariel's entire quest line, the entire one, brings you to this point of no return quest that I mentioned. And what happens here is you go to fight Sauron, and you kind of go on this bridge to Barad-dûr, Sauron's tower, where you see his big flaming eye, for context. And so when you get up there on this bridge, you get attacked by the Wraith of Isildur, and you're able to dominate him, right? Which is a massive, significant thing. You've done this to orcs of all varieties, but to a ring wraith, that's a huge deal. And the ring of power slips off his finger, and this is big story spoilers. And Talion frees him, and Celebrimbor's like, "Why did you do that?" And at this point, you have a split. Celebrimbor wants to go mind control Sauron and bring order that way, to stop the war that way. And Talion is like, what? No, that's not what we're trying to do. And we're trying to stop him, not usurp him. And this is one of the big warnings. You have to be really, really careful when you're fighting against evil, and this is where Celebrimbor fails, of not trying to supplant it. It's really easy to look at a system and say, if only I were the one on top, everything would be better. And the warning here is, when there's some sort of evil going on, you have to be really careful that in your struggles to fight against it, you don't become it. That's what happens to Celebrimbor. He basically wants to set himself up as new Sauron. And instead of a Dark Lord, it's the Bright Lord. But it's the same thing. It's the same sort of dominating, controlling, manipulating force. And what happens is Celebrimbor's like, fine, you don't want to go through with this. I'll go hop into Altariel over here. And she accepts the ring because she is so weary of fighting against evil that she wants to see an end to it at any cost. She's like, you know what? We can put an end to it this way. And the problem is, you're not putting an end to it. You're just changing hands. This happens all the time with revolutions, where when one group has power, other people are like, those people are mean. I want to replace them. And then they replace them with themselves and act in the exact same ways. And the system perpetuates itself. And you have to be really, really careful that when you're fighting evil, you cannot replace it without changing anything. Like, you can't take evil's throne. You have to dismantle it. Because if you take evil's throne, you've just taken evil's throne. So this is sort of the failing of Celebrimbor, and this is the warning here in the fight against evil. Altariel warns us against giving up. And Celebrimbor warns us against seeking to usurp it. And what Talion then does is takes on Isildur's ring, and this enters in the third part of the game. You do have an epic confrontation with Sauron as Celebrimbor and Altariel. And what ends up happening is Celebrimbor and Sauron kind of merge into a big conflicting eye that flashes between Hollywood's favorite colors of blue and orange. And Talion, again, has his neck wound open up, begins bleeding out, and Shelob is like, what are you willing to sacrifice? And he picks up the ring of power that slipped off Isildur's finger. And so in this third part of the game, you play as a not yet Nazgul Talion by himself. And one of the things that's really noticeable in this section is I missed the times when Celebrimbor and Talion spoke that you'd get at like the start of various missions and at various times. They'd speak with each other, and it makes it feel very lonely when you no longer have that interacting dialogue. And I thought that was really interesting. And it kind of emphasizes the significance of the relationship that they had in this struggle. And Celebrimbor and Talion both speaking helped you not feel alone in this fight in a very interesting sort of way, or at least that's how it felt for me. And so I really, really felt when Celebrimbor was no longer there. You still have most of the same moves. This is when you unlock sort of the reanimation abilities. So you can reanimate fallen captains, but they lose 5 levels. But they're always loyal once they've done that. Sometimes orcs will backstab you, by the way. The most common trigger is if you've mind-controlled an orc and he has a blood brother that isn't mind-controlled, and then you kill his blood brother, then he's like, hey, you killed my blood brother, now I'm going to kill you. I'm going to betray you. Sometimes they will cheat death, and if you have an ally that cheats death and you don't resurrect them, sometimes they'll come back and attack you because, like, you didn't save me sort of thing. So in this third phase of the game, you're defending your various fortresses, and there's 10 stages to what's called the Shadow War, and then you get kind of a final cutscene, very lengthy credits. There's a lot of people that worked on this. They put in a lot of work, and I think they did a good job. Like, overall, I really like this game, and I'm probably going to be saying that a lot more when I get down to sort of my criticisms area, because I have a bunch of critiques written down. But anyway, so in this phase, you're fighting just waves of orcs coming to your fortress, and basically you need to hold on to your fortresses. Now, this is where death can really kind of play a part. If you're defending a fortress and you die, you lose the fortress, and then you have to go reconquer it. But this can actually be kind of a lot of fun to reconquer a fortress. There's a lot of different options that you have here, which I really appreciate. Also, they used some of the achievements to encourage trying out some of the interesting systems that they have here. Notably, like, sort of the fastest you can possibly conquer a fortress, and I say fastest in a very loose way. There's an actual, like, mission that you undertake to conquer the fortress. And the fastest that can go is if you have taken the time to defeat all of the war chiefs protecting the fortress, and then replace all of those war chiefs with your own orcs, right? So basically, there's an overlord with all of his war chiefs are actually yours, and then they just like, You just walk into the fortress and they're like, let's open the front door. Here, come in, have all of our points for free. And you just basically go around capturing every single point, like boom, 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 because you like own the entire fortress already. And it's just like, now all I need to do is walk up to the keep and take down the overlord. Which that's a lot of fun to kind of do that. And there's an achievement for it, which I think is really cool. I want to touch upon this nemesis system with the orc quests, because I think it's really important. When you lose a fortress, the orc that you'd had as overlord of that fortress gets captured. So this is one type of nemesis quest. So nemesis quests come like, I guess, in like 3 categories. There's free the guy that got captured. So this is kind of a significant one. And this is where, like I said, your overlord gets captured, and you need to defeat the orc that has him under guard and free him. And then there are kind of vendetta, which is where, I guess there was actually a 4th. I'll come back in a second. So a vendetta is where an orc kills you, and then you go kill him back. And then there. Or you can mind control them or whatever. And then there's death threats. So if you issue a death threat to an orc captain, this creates a special type of quest. And then there's orcs trying to do stuff. Usually it's like chasing each other or fighting ghouls, raiding each other's supplies, just things like that. Water break. And so when you do that, you can step in there and do things, and this gives levels. There's also, I guess, I don't think of these nemesis missions, but I guess I kind of are now that I think about it. You'll sometimes see like a skull in an area, and with this, you can investigate something there, and it's like, okay, there's a captain over in this area that you're looking for, and it's kind of just an additional. It's less a nemesis mission with like a strict structure, and it's more like a world information point. So these are kind of ways that you kind of interact with them. There's some other cool stuff that they do, like when you get intel on an orc. So there's a system where you have partial. Okay, so let's back up. So many like orc captains you don't know anything about until you've encountered them. Once you've seen them, you know what their strengths are, but you don't know anything about their weaknesses. You can go and gain intel on an orc by, usually it's reading the mind of an orc that has a little "I have intelligence" symbol on them. When you do that, you get info about the a captain of your choice, or you can issue a death threat. Alternatively, sometimes you'll find like a map or something that has information. That's a lot rarer. But you can take this bit of information and you can go and get information on their weaknesses. So strengths come in a few different categories. The most significant one, there's a couple of significant areas that you need to look at. The biggest one, I would say, being their immunities, what things they're immune to. So, for example, are they immune to beasts? So they don't take damage from beasts. Or are they immune to poison or frost or whatever? Then there can be things like what weapons they have, combat properties. So this is things where you, like, for example, find if they don't give you it's called no chance. Basically, if you lose all of your health, you're not instantly dead. An orc has to actually like finish you off. And you get a couple of chances to stand back up if you push the right button at the right time. It's not hard. It becomes a little bit harder as you kind of burn through your chances. You start off with native 2. There's a sub ability you can get that gives you a 3rd. But sometimes captains won't give you one. Sometimes a friendly orc or was it Forthog, whatever, that DLC guy will step in and save you, but that's very rare. And that can happen on no chance, I believe. But it might be more common if you've set an orc up as your bodyguard. But which is one of the summon options. There's a summon option. It can be modified by certain armor sets and certain legendary armor sets or equipment sets, and you can also have it be like just some orc grunts, a specific captain that you have mind controlled, or it can be spiders from Shelob once you've completed all of her vision quests. But that one's only really useful if there's an orc that's scared of spiders. There's also the what enrages a captain. When a captain's enraged, it counteracts sort of the broken status, which is when you can mind control them or grab them. So there's also like what weapons they have, like I mentioned that. Things like, do they have henchmen with them, stuff like that. Are they riding a Caragor? There's also like, are they good at killing beasts? That's another thing that you'll see. And then there's weaknesses. So weaknesses come in a couple of broad categories. There's sort of the mortally vulnerable to / terrified of category, which is like, for example, mortally flammable means that if you hit them with fire, it will kill them. It'll take a few seconds, but they'll just burn to death. There's also like terrified of fire, which is like they instantly go into they become basically instantly broken when they're terrified. And then there's I don't remember all of them. There's like 4 categories, but the ones that I generally there's hints, which is like they're vulnerable to these things. Then there's stuff that they're like weak to, that they take more damage from. So like sickly, for example, means that they take more damage from poison. Or like soft-headed means they take more damage from ranged attacks. And then there's fear of. I'm remembering all the categories, hooray. So fear of means that they'll go into a dazed state when the thing they have a fear of happens. Like fear of poison means they go into dazed state when they're poisoned. Fear of stealth is another example. And when this happens and they go into the dazed state, dazed over, like, it cancels out the things they're like immune to. So you can basically hurt them with anything and they'll just kind of like stand there in kind of a stunned state, so you can kind of wail on them for a while. And it really helps you defeat a particularly powerful orc, for example. So anyway, that's kind of going over that sort of thing. I think, let's see, that goes over a lot of that. So at this point, what I want to talk about, because I've covered some of the main themes as well, just kind of looking over the list of things that I have here. Combat, character skills, inventory, the nemesis stuff with orcs. I think I want to cover a few things with fortresses, and then I'll kind of wrap up by going over some of my critiques, and then have some final thoughts. So the fortresses have, I would say, like 4 types of quests associated with them. And there's the Capture This Fortress quest, where you have to capture certain control points and then defeat the Overlord in a large room, with some edges around the side and arrow pickups against a couple of the walls. Arrow pickups are very useful, by the way. They're one of the biggest differences between this game and the first game is this game is a lot stingier with just giving you arrows. Not that you can't like set your character up to give yourself a lot of arrows, but you have to make a conscious decision to sacrifice other combat strengths in order to be able to have more ready access to refilling your ammunition that's not like killing or not picking up world pickups. So for example, there's the drain ability. You can have that recover some amount of arrows. Not compatible, by the way, with the Shadow Dominate skill that uses arrows. I checked that one because it's like, is this okay? They didn't do that. I kind of thought they wouldn't. But when you do that, you give up on either the full heal plus some wrath ability, which is very useful just because full heal is useful, or the dominate grunts ability. Shadow dominate will still dominate them, but otherwise, like this dominate thing turns drain into dominate and consume into dominate and stealth into dominate. Like, you're giving up a lot of ability to make allies. This is somewhat mitigated later in the game by the raise dead ability that you unlock, just because you can then kill them and then raise them, but you're choosing between those. And especially in the middle part of the game, like, you can still dominate captains, it doesn't affect that, but in the middle part of the game, it's a huge choice about, do you want easier access to arrows, or do you want easier access to, or do you want to be able to dominate minions? And then there's also, I mentioned the one where if you have a well-timed counter, you can get arrows back. But do you want that, or do you want the ability to gain might, or do you want the insta-kill? And let me tell you, it's really hard to not just want the insta-kill. So anyway, arrow pickups are significant. So the final area in a fortress where you fight the Overlord is there. So then there are the pit fight missions. These come in kind of basically two flavors. The first one is like, here's a pit fight, send a minion in to fight. And there might be a third that I haven't explored, but send a minion in to fight. If they win, they get levels. And if they lose, then maybe you can recruit the guy who killed them. The game can get very mercenary. So what ends up... so there's those. There's 3 tiers in each region. Completing the 3rd tier, unlocks, each tier gives you a reward the first time you beat it. They're repeatable. And the last tier unlocks an additional war chief slot in your fortress. So it allows you to make your fortress more defensible, which is good because the 3rd type is defend your fortress. These are, I think, mostly story based in the 3rd part of the game. But you have to defend your fortress against attacks by the enemy forces, and this is a good time to get legendary gear because there's usually a legendary guy in charge of the assault. But you have to protect your fortress against assault, and if you die, you lose your fortress, and then can participate in... When you're assaulting a fortress, then the 4th type is... specifically going after war chiefs and killing them, and that weakens the fortress because then their defenses go out and whatnot. So, and they also aren't there to help defend the fortress. So, those are kind of the different types. Oh, the other type of pit mission that I was mentioning is when you infiltrate a captain to be a spy war chief for a fortress. They have to win a pit fight in order to get that position. So. Anyway, those cover those sorts of things. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to sort of the critiques and criticisms. Some of these I might have touched on already, but I've just written down some stuff that I want to go over. So the first one that I have listed here is your character not infrequently does something you don't want, such as try to dodge over an enemy that can't be dodged over. This is... kind of a frustrating thing that can occur sometimes. And I might bring up some related things. I'm just taking a moment to scan over. Okay, so I don't bring it up. Okay, so there's Olagai, for example. An enemy type is immune to the consume ability, unless you have a specific subskill unlocked that lets you do it to them. This is notable because sometimes you'll hit it and it'll be like, you meant to use this on that Olagai over there and not this other orc right here, right? There can be very hectic situations and the game has to kind of make decisions, and this is something I sympathize with the developers on having to do, on where they're going to direct your character's action. And sometimes they do stuff that you don't mean. Trying to dodge over an Olagai is a really good example. Trying to dodge over a vault breaker enemy is a really good example. This is a property that certain captains have where you can't jump over them. And it's really easy to do this by accident where you're trying to dodge to the side, and instead the game's like, you meant to dodge over this guy, right? Like, it's mostly a nuisance, but it can get really frustrating. The consume thing is, because you can't just like raw consume a captain either. If they're broken, which happens if their health gets low enough and they're not enraged or they are terrified, then you can just consume them and dominate them, but otherwise you can't, and it wastes might to do that against. Sorry, I'm going to be honest here. This has gone on a lot longer than I anticipated, and I did not prepare enough water. So anyway, that can waste might, and it can be kind of frustrating. So just like sometimes I jump to his spot also when I'm like trying to go off. And this kind of comes to the next thing that I have written down here is sometimes movement choices aren't well understood. Do I want to vault up the building or jump off of it? This can be a little frustrating at times, and some amount of it is like my own fault for not pushing the right buttons, but sometimes it's like, no, I wanted to go over there, and it doesn't quite work. And like, I feel for them because it's like they can't psychically know where we want, and to give them a lot of credit, for the most part, it does a really good job. Like, their systems do a really good job of being like, you want to go over here, right? And it's like, yeah, most of the time, yeah, that is where I wanted to go. But sometimes it isn't, and that can be a little frustrating, and it's not really a problem they could solve. It just, I felt the need to bring it up. The next sort of thing that I wanted to bring up is that some orcs, like some orc captains, have really absurdly frustrating skill combinations that can make them really tedious to kill. Like half an hour or plus on an overlord trying to kill, sort of thing. Occasionally this is like the player's fault. There's two examples that come to mind with this. The first was like an orc that has one of the abilities that an orc can have is if you leave them alone, they recover their health by doing like a focus thing. There's also the tank class. You have to basically kill them twice. They get a last chance as well, just like you get usually. And it's just like this guy that I actually rage quit on because it's like I was getting so close to having him dead and then I died, and it's just like the most frustrating thing. But then I went back with a slightly different configuration. Basically, I brought along a very powerful orc follower of my own, and he was able to like take the guy down, and it was almost anticlimactic. But sometimes you just get these combinations which are really frustrating and tedious. Also, the last orc that I had to beat to basically beat the game, because it was the final stage of the game. You have your 4 fortresses, because nobody assaults Minas Morgul except you once at the transition point in the game, between you plus Celebrimbor to you as Ringwraith. So Minas Morgul is fine, it's chillin'. But the other 4 fortresses of Sergos, Kiriath Ungol, Gorgoroth, and Nurnin, you have to defend all of them in the final stage. And the final one, the final defense, I failed, and then I had to go take it back. And that Overlord in that final fight took a long time. It was really tedious. He had some sort of ability to restore his health. He had an immunity to like poison and fire and frost and curse. So it's like I can't do any sort of special things to him. He might have been arrow proof too. And so he was just like really, really hard to get damage on. And the only weakness he had was a fear of Morgai flies. And there are no Morgai flies in a friggin' Overlord arena. And it was just super tedious. Eventually he became terrified. I have no idea why. Maybe it's like, I've been fighting this guy for 40 minutes and he's still not dead. What the heck do I do? But yeah, that was a long fight. So that will happen sometimes, that orcs just get these really, really frustrating skill combinations that just make them really hard to kill. Sometimes it's context. Like I said, certain overlords are just like so hard to actually kill. Something else that can happen is some stuff feels like it lacks iframes. So like what I mean is by this is sometimes like something will happen to you mid animation. It feels like there's nothing you can do about it, and it can feel really unfair. This is moving on to the next sort of point. One of the things that kind of relates to this is post recovery. Like when you get knocked down, you're getting back up. It feels like you can be caught in the middle of this sometimes. And that can be really frustrating because you're just like suddenly like you're getting chain hit by stuff, and it can feel like you can have a hard time kind of escaping from stuff, or like you're in the middle of an attack animation and you see an attack coming and you try to hit the counter button, but you don't hit it. Either you don't hit it quickly enough, or it can't cancel the animation or something like that. I don't know. It's a little hard for me to sort of explain without somebody having play experience with it, but it's something that can happen that can be really frustrating. And then the next thing that I kind of, and yeah, this is sort of linked to sort of the next one that I have, is there are just times when it feels like the animations trump gameplay, leading to feel bad moments. And like these are all kind of like the same sort of critique, which is just there are times when it feels like stuff is just slightly unfair, and it's hard for me to like pin down exactly, but when you play the game, you'll experience these moments where you're like, but I hit the counter button, or I hit dodge, or oh come on, stop hitting me, I'm trying to dodge here. Or like you get back up and you're like, oh come on, I was trying to escape, just climb onto the building, darn it. Just stuff like that, and there can be frustrating moments that way. And then the last thing that I've written down here, so when you die, orcs taunt you. So there's, and then there's, when you encounter them, there's intros. And there can be sometimes an orc will reintroduce himself, like if you've been away from them for a long enough period of time. I'm not entirely sure what triggers that. And then also, like, when you trigger a war chief to enter the area, they have, like, a welcome introduction. And then when you actually, like, welcome to the arena, and then when you actually confront them, they have another one. So sometimes these can get really old. It's just like, shut up and let me kill you, sort of thing. This happens particularly in the later part of the game, that third part, because when you're defending your fortress, you'll sometimes, and like all captains will have these sort of like intros, right? And whenever you die, you get taunted. But when you're in the middle of this later part of the game, this third phase where you're a ring wraith, sort of proto ring wraith, trying to tie up the forces of Mordor to like maintain a stalemate between you and Sauron Celebrimbor. That period of time where you're trying to hold the stalemate is when you're defending one of your fortresses. Sometimes there'll be like a bunch, like 4, 5, 6 captains in an area, and you'll just sometimes have them chain introductions. So it's almost comical at that point, where it's like, and in my notes I have it written, and sometimes it can get really silly when like you have 3+ orcs introduce themselves in a row, and it can get really, really silly that way. So I looked through the options. You can't turn those off. Sometimes I kind of wish you could. Just like I said, in that it's not really a problem so much until that latter part of the game, where you just have so many captains that you're dealing with, particularly in those fortress defenses, that you have, like, you're in the middle of combat and all of a sudden like 3, 4, 5 orc captains in a row need to introduce themselves. When I say introduce, I mean talk about how they want to kill you and eat your flesh or whatever, orcish things. And it's just like, oh come on guys, let's just fight, please. Can we just fight? You don't need to tell me all of these things. To their credit, they have a decent variety in what these introductions are, but I mean, there's only so many they can have in the game, right? And when you're in a phase of the game where you can have in multiple siege defenses, like multiple instances of captains coming at you, because what you have is you have 6 assaulting war chiefs that come in 3 waves. But if they capture control point, another war chief shows up, and has a welcome, and then can also confront you. And there's also a bunch of captains that come with these war chiefs, so it makes a huge mess. Great opportunity to mind control a lot of new guys, though. But anyway, so that's kind of my list of critiques. Like I said, I don't feel like the loot crates are a particular problem. I think that people overblow them just because of a gaming atmosphere. I enjoyed the game overall tremendously. I liked it a lot. I did not give them any extra money for loot crates. I did buy the season pass because I liked the game enough. But overall, kind of concluding thoughts. One, this has been a lot longer than I thought it would be. I'm not sure how much people are going to like this or not. But overall thoughts on the game, I really liked it. I liked what they did with the combat systems. I liked a lot of the changes they made. You're still extremely powerful, but you have to kind of figure it out, and it's more situationally powerful. In Shadow of Mordor, you would get to the point where sort of the best thing that you could do, like straight power-wise, was Shadow Strike a bunch of orcs to get your hit streak meter up, and then consume an orc to get all of your ammo back, and then just repeat that. And that was really powerful. That doesn't happen in this game, in part because the systems are functioning differently. You also have to make a lot of choices. It can be a little strange at times to pause mid-battle to change your gear and character layout. That's something you can do, and there are certain... if I'm leveling another critique at the game, there are certain times where it feels kind of arbitrary that a certain ability is a sub-ability that you have to like choose between having or not. But overall, I like how that system kind of creates interplay, and it allows you to shift your character's strengths around depending upon like the weaknesses of the captain that you're facing, the sort of thing that you want to do, the sort of situation that you're in, and it makes that a lot more interesting. I really appreciate the online features that they have that add a little bit more. They add a lot of replayability, post-game replayability, which I really appreciate as well. The story ended up being a lot deeper than I was sort of expecting at the beginning. The beginning, you have kind of a lot of... we need to get the Plantier. I want to save Minas Ithil. We need to get the Plantier. I want to save Minas Ithil. Going on sort of banter between Talion and Celebrimbor. But it does kind of set up their different perspectives. Celebrimbor doesn't really care about Middle-earth. He just wants to conquer Mordor. It feels like that's what he's really on about. And as things progress, he gets more and more... obsessed with it, and they actually really do sort of show as you lead up to his moment of trying to usurp Sauron. They really show that that's the path that he's on, and I kind of really was feeling, and I'm like, like I didn't think they were going to go there, but they did, and so I was actually quite surprised with sort of the depth of the story, the depth of the themes. It really does a good job. Also, because one of the things with open world games is explaining why you can still play after you finish the main plot, as it were. And this game breaks up its main plot in a way that I really like. It's really interesting the way that they've set up sort of quest chains for you to kind of follow at your leisure. And sort of the way that it plays into the overarching theme of, also with the post-game of, look, your goal is to stand against evil as long as you can, and you might fall eventually. And this is actually really interesting. Again, more story spoilers on sort of the final cutscene that you get at the end of the Shadow Wars phase. The game is broken up into more than 3 acts, by the way, but I think it is 3. In the Shadow Wars phase, you really have... and that's where you're defending all of your fortresses, and there's 10 seasons of that, as it were. You get sort of a concluding cutscene, and it basically says, look, Talion held out for decades. He kept Mordor entangled within itself for a really long time, but he eventually fell. He eventually became a Nazgul. He eventually pursued the One Ring in the Shire, but he was freed when Frodo threw the ring in. And it has this sort of theme of, maybe you can't defeat this evil that is plaguing you, But if you fight against it as long as you can, maybe somebody else can defeat it, and you'll be free. And there's this almost sort of religious themology with that is really meaningful to me, and it's something that I really appreciated as a theme in this, where it's saying the struggle is worthwhile. Maybe you can't hold out forever. Hold out as long as you can. Try to not give up, and just keep at it. Keep going. Because sometimes stalemate is victory. And he needs to learn to see it that way. And one of the other things also that I really appreciate about the game is some of Italian's speeches when you reconquer a fortress in that Shadow of War phase, where it's like, it's not a setback, it's an opportunity. And we won't give up on holding these fortresses. We will reconquer them and reconquer them. And if the enemy defeats us, that's fine. We will get back up and we will reconquer them. If they're going to throw our armies at us, they'll swell our ranks. And we'll just keep reconquering. We're not going to give up. And in many ways, it's a game about how sometimes you're in a situation where you can't win. You can only fight to not lose. And in those situations, you need to fight to not lose. And I think this is really kind of relevant in a lot of ways, in a lot of things going on in our world, where it's really easy to try to take an easy route to victory that's not actually victory. You've not won. It's either a form of giving up, or it's turning into the thing you're trying to fight against. And this game really plays into those themes. And I thought that was really interesting. And there's so much that kind of plays into it. There's so much of like, even somebody as ludicrously overpowered as Talion, realistically speaking, can't stop this. But somebody as underpowered as Frodo can. And that's kind of, in some ways, a theme that goes on in this game is sort of more with how it wraps it up. But that puts a nice ribbon on the end. So I really found a lot of those themes really interesting. I found a lot of the combat improvements that they did really interesting. A lot of the build stuff is really interesting. It's really cool when you're in stealth and you just like stealth chain like 7 orcs down. That's pretty late game situation where you're able to do that much, but it's pretty crazy. It is a game that I think is worth playing. If you like action games, it was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the DLC. Let's see. Do I have anything else to say? It just looks like we're coming up on 2 hours. So if you have enjoyed this, I thank you for listening to this entire giant thing. I'm happy to answer questions about it. I definitely have a lot of other thoughts from a game designer standpoint of how to do certain things well, how to avoid certain traps, particularly when it comes to sort of the critiques that I have of especially the orcs with absurdly frustrating skill combinations that render them exceedingly tedious to kill. I have a lot of thoughts about how to approach that sort of thing. But yeah, so this was an interesting game. I liked a lot of the changes that they made, and at this point I'm kind of repeating myself, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you for listening. There'll be another one of these for some other game. Not sure which one it'll be, but maybe it will be shorter, maybe it won't be. At any rate, thank you for listening. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.